and welcome to On Point. I'm Tomi Lahren. Well, folks, we are a nation of proud immigrants, but undocumented, illegal immigrants, whatever you want to call them, are flooding across our borders, and if Obama has his way, they'll be here to stay. Now, the word amnesty is tossed around quite a bit. We have to do something with the 11 million illegal immigrants in this country. But it comes with a cost that no one seems to be talking about. But leave it to me and the Heritage Foundation to break it down for you. A Heritage Foundation study reveals that amnesty would cost about $6.3 trillion. How? Well, already illegal immigrants rack up the cost on police, hospitals, schools, and other government services. A path to citizenship means that it's just a matter of time before they'll qualify for other government programs like welfare, Social Security, Medicare, and Obamacare too. Why? Well, illegal immigrants have relatively low earning potential because, according to the Heritage Report, on average they have 10th grade educations and often fill low-skill positions. The government benefits received minus taxes paid leaves us with a negative fiscal effect. So what does this mean for everyday Americans? Well, it means bloating the welfare system and entitlement programs. And who's going to pay for it? Taxpayers, of course. Joining me now to discuss the consequences of broken immigration policy is civil rights attorney Mark Eisenberg. So, Mark, aren't the costs of amnesty unfair for everyone involved?
Well, it's certainly unfair for the American citizenship who's going to bear the cost of this. Obviously, those who've come over illegally or are seeking the amnesty, they stand to benefit.
Well, of course they do, but isn't that the point? Do you think that that's part of the game here? Amnesty means more votes on the side of Democrats?
Well, I don't disagree with that, and I think there's a real problem with the system. There's really no reason or basis for granting amnesty simply because somebody's been here for a sufficient length of time, having entered the country in the first instance illegally.
And why do you think that nobody talks about these costs? I mean, I mentioned a few earlier, but there are a lot of other hidden costs. Not to mention, in my opinion, amnesty is not only unfair to Americans, but it's unfair to lawful immigrants. There are about 4 million people waiting to come into this country, and it's easier to break the law than to follow it. So it's really unfair for a lot of people. What do you have to say to that?
Well, it's curious because with the illegal immigration we've seen of late involving the minors coming over the border unaccompanied, the individuals are being dispersed through various states, you're seeing a lot of immigrants actually protesting over these individuals being placed in their city and neighboring cities until dealt with by INS. And I found that very curious, being fourth-generation American, to see immigrants themselves taking issue with those who have come to the country illegally and now seek benefits and asylum here.
Well, absolutely. And let's talk about jobs, too, because that's one of the main issues that keeps coming up, not only in elections, but on the minds of everyday Americans. Jobs. If we grant all these people amnesty and they have a path to citizenship, then other low-skill workers that are filling these positions now have to compete with a huge influx of people. So what about that?
Well, it's an interesting dilemma, but curiously, many Americans through the Reagan years and beyond felt that those jobs were below them in the first place. And as a consequence, there were a considerable number of vacancies in those positions filled by illegals, which resulted in some crackdowns from an employment law standpoint to ensure that American employers were employing individuals who were lawfully in the country. But I think notwithstanding the Great Recession, if you will, there are still a huge number of vacancies, whether they be migrant-type jobs or lower-paying minimum wage-type jobs that are still available, which citizens don't want to fill. So I think, in some respects, there's a need, but I don't think by granting these individuals amnesty that solves the problem.
Well, that's kind of exactly what I want to talk about, because it seems to be that both sides put arguments on the table and amnesty is talked about, but on the Republican side, if a Republican mentions amnesty, you don't say that, because obviously, as we see with Eric Cantor, you get in trouble for even mentioning that. And so Obama's plans, it doesn't seem like anyone has like a really very clear solution here. So if not amnesty, what in your eyes can we do that's going to appease all sides here?
Well, first off, there is a tremendous need for immigration reform.
Absolutely.
Both houses of the Senate were meeting of the minds to present something suitable to Obama, and Obama himself, while making this part of his overall agenda as part of his second term, has really gotten nowhere with it. But the system is broken and needs to be fixed. My ancestors came over in the late 1800s, and they worked the types of jobs, if you will, that we've been discussing that these illegals who have granted amnesty would take. And it's just the natural order of things. The next generation tends to become educated. The next generation tends to go to college. And by the second or third or even fourth generation, you're seeing college graduates, if not professionals, stemming from these otherwise illegals now granted amnesty.
And I understand that as well, but I have to say you brought up college educations. So for me, as someone who just graduated college, I'm seeing illegal immigrants qualifying for deferred action in the DREAM Act. And for me, I find that really unfair because my education wasn't subsidized. So what do you say to those people?
I've got a real problem with it. And I sympathize for those that have worked hard, that have paid their dues in this country, that are legal, and have been deprived access or an opportunity or admission to these universities and colleges because under the DREAM Act or otherwise, we're having, and here in the state of California, we're seeing undocumented aliens taking positions that students who are citizens rightfully should be entitled to. It's a problem.
Well, absolutely. And not only that, but from my perspective, it rewards unlawful behavior. And that's not acceptable in any other area of the government. So why in illegal immigration is it acceptable to reward unlawful behavior?
I'm not saying it is, and I would never take that position. The problem is where you have a House and a Senate that can't agree on anything, that can't put a bill together that would consist of considerable and appropriate reform for this problem. There's nothing Obama can do. An executive order by itself is not going to resolve this issue, but it needs to be addressed. For instance, these children that are coming over the borders now, the process of deportation needs to be speeded up. But
I agree with you.
Happen by way of executive order, and it doesn't appear through congressional action it's going to happen either. They can't even agree on a sum of money necessary to fund the enforcement of the continuing and ongoing illegals that we're seeing coming in through Texas, Arizona, and even California to a lesser extent.
Now, what I think we need to do is I do think we need to streamline the process. We need to figure out what needs to be done with all the people that are already here, but we need to seal those borders. But I guess we'll have to wait and see if that's going to happen any day soon. But thanks so much for being with us. And when On Point returns, what does the co-founder of Greenpeace have to say about the hyped-up global warming crisis? His view might surprise you. Stay with us to find out. On to climate change now. Well, I can't sit here and deny that climate change exists to some extent. However, I do believe that climate alarmists are pumping up the crisis and forcing it down our throats. But don't take my word for it. Last month, the Heartland Institute hosted a conference on climate change where some of the world's leading climate scientists and researchers discussed some of the myths of the global warming crisis. Take a look.
100 years ago or 200 years ago, out of every 10,000 molecules in the atmosphere, 3 of them, only 3 out of 10,000, were carbon dioxide. Now, after 100 or 200 years of carbon dioxide emissions, 4 out of 10,000 are carbon dioxide. There's very little carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
We have record low burnage as far as acreage. Yet if a wildfire occurs, people are going to say, look at that, wildfires or tornadoes. The fact that the total global hurricane activity, tropical activity, has plummeted the way it has.
There's now huge money in it. Academia gets $2.7 billion a year in this country alone and really all over the world. So it's mostly politics and money.
Well, for me, the most interesting point from the conference was that less than 1% of scientific papers in the last 21 years claim that warming is predominantly man-made. In fact, scientific evidence points to moderate rather than severe global warming. Joining me now to discuss this so-called crisis is the co-founder of Greenpeace, Dr. Patrick Moore. Thanks so much for being with us, Patrick.
Nice to be with you, Tommy.
So, Patrick, what do you make of this trumped-up global warming crisis?
Well, I think at the base of it, there's a very powerful convergence of interests. Environmentalists who want to raise money on seeing as though they're saving the world, politicians who want to save babies and get elected and who are able to convince people that even though they're not scientists themselves, they somehow are sold on this whole idea. Businesses who want to appear green, scientists who want to get grants. It's very difficult to get a grant for science research these days unless it's somehow tied into climate change. And whole academic institutions, as was mentioned in the intro, that are dependent on over $2 billion a year in federal money. This is one of the big problems, is the science establishment has become dependent on taxpayers' money rather than private money, as it was for so many centuries, in fact, in the past. So a powerful convergence of interests, plus this overarching concept that we are destroying the whole world's atmosphere and thus the whole ecology of the world and human civilization along with it, and throw in all of the sort of original sin kind of language, and it's almost a new religion along with a new ideology. So I think that's what makes it doubly powerful. It's both a political ideology and a kind of fundamentalist religion at the same time.
Patrick, you bring up a lot of good points, and I want to turn now because you mentioned that the scientific community might not be in so much of a consensus as the mainstream media and the government portrays them to be. So why is everybody getting this so wrong? Because I know when I watch the news, all I hear is gloom and doom, as you mentioned. So why is everybody seem to be agreeing to this consensus if it's not really there?
It's only in the media that everybody seems to be agreeing to some consensus. There are thousands of scientists who do not buy into it all around the world. And in fact, in Russia, most of the academy scientists there do not buy into it, but rather believe that the sun is the predominant controller of the Earth's climate. Obviously, the sun is the main thing that allows life to be on this Earth, right, and also is the driver of most of our weather. So there is no consensus. The reason the skeptical community has grown despite the one-sided media is because there's so many people blogging these days and so many people communicating through the internet, and that's where you get the information about what's really going on here.
Well, and I understand that, and I hope the American people are open to looking to that as well. But I know from what I've seen, if a scientist comes out and even moderately denies climate change or global warming, it seems to be that they're labeled an extremist or a nutcase. So what do you say to that? Do you see that happening? Because I know I sure do.
Absolutely. You have to be quite brave to speak out on this subject, and you certainly have to be independent, because if you're dependent on any of these other elites, the environmental movement, the media, the green business community, the political establishment, if you're dependent on that, and scientists too, then you cannot speak out because you will lose your position, you will lose your status. And I've been an independent scientist all my life, PhD in ecology and Bachelor of Science in biology and forestry. So I know my science and genetics and chemistry, biochemistry and all of that. And I've studied climate right from the beginning. So I understand the fundamentals. The main point is there is no scientific proof that humans are the main cause of the slight bit of warming that has happened in the last 150 years. But this warming period has been happening for over 250 years, long before there were significant human emissions. And it's just part of a natural warming trend coming out of the Little Ice Age into what is now a relatively warm period in the post-glacial 10,000 years that we've been through now, but is actually nowhere near as warm now as it was between 5,000 and 9,000 years ago, what's called the Holocene thermal optimum or maximum. So the timelines on this are thousands, millions, hundreds of millions, and billions of years, as the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, and the climate has been happening on it all through those years and had nothing to do with human beings. And even though we may have some effect on local weather and climates due to changing the vegetation patterns of the Earth, etc., it is very unlikely that we are much of a cause of anything, and certainly not anything catastrophic. As a matter of fact, many of us believe that higher CO2 will be largely beneficial for humanity and for nature.
I have to ask you, too, because you bring up CO2. I want to talk, my last question for you, about EPA regulations. So these regulations are crippling some businesses. Do you think we've already done enough in the form of regulations, or do there need to be more?
The EPA should be scrapped at this point because it is so far off the rails on the science. There is no basis to call carbon dioxide a pollutant or a toxic when it is, in fact, the most important food for all life on Earth. Carbon dioxide is what plants eat in order to make sugars, combining CO2 with water using sunlight as the catalyst for photosynthesis. And that little bit of carbon dioxide, only 0.04% of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide, is the fundamental food for everything that lives on this Earth. And if it disappeared, actually, if it goes down to 150 parts per million, it's now at 400. If it went down to 150, all the plants would start dying because that's the threshold. Also, carbon dioxide has been at 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, even 10,000 parts per million during the era of modern life, the last 550 million years. And actually, it's been higher than it is now through most of modern life. And the optimum CO2 level for plants is about 1,500 ppm, nearly 4 times higher than it is today.
Well, Patrick,
so
we certainly can trust what you're saying because you are trained in this. So you heard it here first. We have a self-described environmentalist telling us that maybe the media is getting it wrong. Thank you so much for being with us, Patrick. And coming up next, what happens when both sides come to the table to discuss the conflict in Gaza? Find out when On Point returns. Trust me, you don't want to miss this one.
Agreed, and we implemented 6 ceasefires so far. All of them were violated by the Hamas. And at the end of the day, we already pull out from Gaza. You know, the whole world told us, withdraw from Gaza, deliver Gaza to the Palestinians. We evacuated all the Jewish settlements from Gaza. And Abu Mazen and the Palestinians gave us clear commitment. I'm quoting now, once the Israeli occupation inside Gaza is over, once there are no Jewish settlements in Gaza, there will be no rockets, no hostilities whatsoever from Gaza into Israel.
So one of the reasons
Since then,
one of the reasons why this campaign,
15,000 rockets were launched from Gaza into Israel, 3,000 only in the last 3 weeks.
Welcome back to On Point. The conflict in the Middle East has been eating up the headlines in recent weeks, and for good reason. But this conflict is nothing new. The root of the tension is who gets what land and how it's controlled. This brings us to today. The violence was sparked by the murder of 3 Israeli students, followed by the burning of a 16-year-old Palestinian boy by Israeli extremists. This opened the floodgates, and here we are with an ongoing crisis on our hands. The death toll is mounting, especially on the Palestinian side. Now, this issue is controversial and emotionally charged on both sides. And here at On Point, we want to bring you a balanced approach. With that said, joining me now to tackle this tough issue is Speaker for Israeli Advocacy, Tibi Zohar, and human rights activist Mo Diab. Thank you guys so much for being here. And I want to start off by talking about these settlements. And Mo, I want to toss it to you first. If Israel stopped settling this area, would the problem be somewhat solved? Would peace talks be able to continue? What do you think?
Absolutely. In the past several years, the United Nations General Assembly security members have all voted and clearly stated that the biggest obstacle to a long-lasting peace resolution is the construction of the Jewish settlements in occupied Palestinian land. So during the last round of peace talks, Israel continued building settlements in the occupied Palestinian land. There are over 500,000 Jewish settlers living in occupied Palestinian land, which has already been voted to be a sovereign Palestinian state. So the talks have not been taken seriously, given that the construction of the settlements continues and the populating of the Palestinian state continues with Jewish settlers.
You know, I can certainly understand this, but TB, I want to give you a chance to respond to that as well. So why does Israel seem to be settling this area? Is there a reason for it?
Well, first and foremost, I'm happy that my fellow here cited the United Nations. It's the same United Nations that voted to divide the country in 1948 between two peoples. And obviously, you know, Israel, Jews, accepted that. They had no choice. That's what they've been given. They had nothing else. Even though the Arabs had 22 states.
And Israel only has one state, which is fair to mention.
Yep, and unfortunately, they did not accept it then. Not only did they not accept, they move in on the 600,000 Jews with 6 armies, and the Arabs, Palestinians were not existent there at that point, but the Arabs were double, were 1 million too. And so now when we cite the United Nations, when it's convenient for us, sometimes it's convenient and sometimes it's not. The question is not what happens with the settlement. The question is, why can Israel have 20% of its population Arab living and participating, and the Palestinian Authority or state cannot have 200,000 Jews in it? Why do they need to be Jew-rein, Jew-clean? What is this ethnic cleansing atmosphere? How do you start a state this way? I don't understand that.
I think on both sides there's been charges of ethnic cleansing. So, Mo, I want to turn that to you. What's your response to what he said? Does Israel have a right to feel threatened? I mean, I think both sides probably have a right to feel threatened, but what do you make of it?
I think it's very important to approach the fact starting from the inception of the Jewish state. Starting from the beginning, Palestine was a sovereign nation. Palestine has generations and generations of families, culture, and lifestyle there. And I don't think anyone can question that. And occupying power came in. It wasn't a military. It was the Zionist movement. It was a militia. It was a movement that wanted to create its own state. They went into a nation. They massacred hundreds of thousands. They displaced 750,000 Palestinians in their own nation. So saying why can't they be in the new Palestinian state, the settlements, the freezing of the settlements is a point for the peace talks to discuss. It shows that the Israeli side does not have good faith intentions in the actual peace talks. So that question really, it's a mainstream media rhetoric that's always saying ethnically cleansing, and it's making the Israeli side as the victims in this. And I really feel that pointing out the fact that the Palestinian state is going from a Palestinian nation and the land is shrinking. So the idea that Israel has been a nation for thousands of years is really misleading the public. It's been 66 years. It was a forced inception. It was a colonizing power. And to this day, there are Palestinians who were born there that cannot go back to their homes, that cannot live there, that cannot get citizenship there. But if you are Jewish anywhere in the world, regardless of your nationality, you have the right to return. The Palestinians do not have the right to return. Where are these Palestinian refugees going to go? Almost 7 million Palestinian refugees. Where are they going to go? If they are to have the right of return under international law, under UN resolutions, they will be in the Palestinian state, which has already been agreed upon.
I'm glad you brought up the right to return, because that's been a sticking point for a lot of the peace negotiations. So I want to see, TB, what do you think about that, this right to return, these refugees returning to their land? Do you think that this is a valid assertion, it's a valid claim to this area?
Well, I'm really stunned by the history that I learned here.
I know, I've heard various histories myself, and that's why this issue is so hard.
This is an interesting history to hear. In 1920, the Jewish population versus the Muslim population, there were no Palestinians back then. There was, of course, no government or ruling of any kind of source of Palestinians. There were no Palestinians. There were Arabs there, some of them from around and some of them indigenous, indeed. Some of them actually originate from Jews, you know, that weren't expelled by the Romans. But that's a whole different issue. What happened was between 1945 and 1948, about 300,000 ashes from Europe, from Buchenwald, from Auschwitz, had nowhere to go. And so what
the Zionist movement there, is that
the word Zionist is not relevant here. Okay. What happened was Moishele was 14 years old looking at the gate opening at Buchenwald and had no family, no home to go back to. Because Germany and Poland, anybody else, of course, they had nowhere to go. The only thing they remembered was next year in Jerusalem, next year in Jerusalem. So they had nowhere to go. So these 300, if they had come to the U.S., just like we know now on the border, no one would dispute that they need help. Well, they came in, they never asked for their Arabs for money or anything else. They doubled the population from 300,000 Jews. It doubled within 3 years to to 600,000 Jews, 1 million to Arabs, 6 armies, and all of a sudden we conquered the land. Now, they didn't come with arms. They didn't come with anything. They owned nothing. They came in and they got a piece of the land from the United Nations and said, okay. And this is history, nothing else. Now, they didn't have an army for about 3 weeks since the declaration and the war. They only had a few fractions of little organizations. They formed an army, and what do you know? We beat you guys. I'm sorry. And that was not planned. Now, what happened was, indeed, there was an exchange of refugees. Arab countries expelled between 800,000 and 1 million Jews that came to Israel. Yes, within that realm, 600 to 700,000 of the Arabs, yes, they fled because they thought the Jews behaved like them. They were scared the Jews will slaughter them. That didn't happen because Jews don't do that.
Well,
and you can see that in the world right now.
It's
no question.
Very interesting narratives on both sides. So we do have conflicting history here, and I think that's been happening for decades. When we come back, though, I want to talk about the solutions. So stay with us. Maybe we can find some common ground here when we return.
عقيدتنا في قتالكم أننا سنبيدكم على بكرة أبيكم ولن نبقي منكم أحدا لأنكم ظلام الأرض وشذاذ الآفاق ومرتزقة الزمان بل مرتزقة كل زمان. راجعوا التاريخ أيها الإخوة، فما وجد اليهود في مكان إلا سعوا فيه فسادا. ألم تقف على قول الله يا مسلم؟ ويسعون في الأرض، والألف واللام في كلمة الأرض تفيد الشمول والعموم، ويسعون في الأرض فسادا والله لا يحب المفسدين.
It is highly likely that among the casualties are going to be women and children. As of yet, no official comment from the Israeli side, but it does follow a similar incident back on Wednesday. In that particular incident, some 20 people were killed when the Israeli shells hit another UN school where hundreds of displaced people were seeking shelter.
Well, you might hear the narrative that the majority of people killed in Israel's Operation Protective Edge are mostly women and children, but this is actually false. Despite what the mainstream media tells us, fact is that over 80% of the nearly 2,000 civilians killed since July were males, half of which were between 18 and 28 years old. By the way, these numbers were reported by Al Jazeera, and last time I checked, they're not exactly pro-Israel. But returning to our panel now, we got a chance to hear from TV about the refugees, and we want to give Mo a chance to respond to that. So Mo, take it away.
Regarding your statement saying that there essentially were no Palestinians in Palestine, I find that to be incredibly insulting. I find it to be incredibly ignorant, giving historical records. Most Israeli parliament members don't even deny this. There's a rich history in Palestine, a culture. By denying that, you are denying their existence in its very essence. Now, also saying that the Jews that from the Holocaust...
I said no Palestinians, but yes, Arabs. I didn't say they
Arabs,
were not. They weren't called Palestinians.
Referring to Palestinians strictly as Arabs is a way to take away their actual Palestinian identity.
What I'm saying is
to normalize
Jewish Palestinians back then living in Palestine.
Yes, and Jesus was a Jewish Palestinian.
Exactly.
So by saying that there were no Palestinians, you're actually denying.
Well, in the time of Jesus, he wasn't called Palestine yet, so that is a little misconception, because when Jesus, actually that's not true. He wasn't a Palestinian, because Palestine was actually a name Roman gave after Jesus. I'm sorry. So there was no, Jesus was not a Palestinian.
Regardless
but you claim
of
Jesus
whether,
is a Palestinian, which is not,
regardless
it's not
of
unique
whether,
for you guys.
Regardless of whether we disagree
Even
or not,
Jesus was a
I think the statements that you made were meant to be intentionally misleading to let the public and the viewers see that there were no such thing as Palestinians there. Also, to your point with the Holocaust and the refugee population, it's important to point out that the Zionist movement pointed out dozens of locations to settle a Jewish state. In Argentina, in Kenya, in Madagascar, Palestine was by no means their #1 destination. So the religious claims to put a Jewish state in Palestine hold no water, considering the fact that they had religious claims in Britain, in Argentina, in Kenya, and Madagascar. The reason they settled in Palestine is they were weak and defenseless. That was the only reason they settled there. To say that the Jews came in...
The Jews were weak and defenseless?
No, the Palestinians had no military.
Oh, and the Jews did.
And the Jews had militias, the Haganah. The Jews had several militias, and these militias came in throughout the years, and they would massacre villages and towns. This is actually a public record, BBC Radio. You can look up something called the Village Files, which shows that these militias came in under the Zionists and actually went to village by village and massacred anyone who was a threat to the soon-to-be founded Jewish state.
How many died?
How many died?
How many were massacred?
We do
tens of thousands were massacred. 750,000 to 1 million were displaced, and it's ongoing.
Do you know how many Arabs died not of the surrounding country you call Palestinians? How many Israel or Palestine Arabs were killed in 1948?
I do want to get away. I do want to get away from the he said, she said, because we have a lot of stats and figures being thrown around. But I want to bring it back to very much so nuts and bolts, and maybe we can find some common ground is what I'm hoping for. So what I want to discuss is the solutions. So from what I've heard, we've got three. One is the one-state solution. We erase the borders, but then we're left with what do we do with Jerusalem? Two is a two-state solution. Again, what do we do with the disputed boundaries? Where do we draw the lines? And three is just the overall destruction of one side or the other. Now, all three sound like very difficult and almost like between a rock and a hard place here, but I want to throw it to you guys. Are any of these solutions viable? And if not, is there one? And Mo, I want to toss it to you first, and then TB will give you a chance to respond.
I think there's a lot of debate about the one-state, two-state for various reasons. In April of 2014, the unity government with Fatah and Hamas, represented by Mahmoud Abbas, said that they were willing to work on a two-state solution. Now, the obstacles to a two-state solution is the continued settlement building, and Israel claims that it's going to be a demographic threat if there's a one-state solution.
Because then Jews would be the minority, correct?
Expected, not a minority. Currently, there are more Jews that are in Israel, but the numbers are starting to level out.
I do have a question for you, Mo, though, because you brought something that's very interesting to me. You mentioned the unity government, and I really want to get into this, and TB, I want to get your response to that as well. Is this a problem here for Israel because now they're uniting with Hamas in a way, and because Hamas doesn't recognize Israel? Is that another sticking point in peace talks? TB, I want to give you a chance to speak to that.
Well, first, the one-state solution was actually an Israeli idea.
Okay.
Originally.
Which
was fiercely unaccepted by Arabs. And you can see an
why is that?
Well, they can't stand Jews. It's very easy. I mean,
is that fair to say?
That's absolutely
they just
unfair
can't stand
to say.
Jews. And in history, by the way, it wasn't
show
true.
That 50 to 70% of Palestinians actually side for not only a Palestinian state, around 60% side on the Jewish side for a Palestinian state. And the reason is not because they hate Jews. Really, it's this political rhetoric. It's a public discourse that is proliferating the idea of anti-Semitism, when in reality, the college kids, the young ones, all those who compose the majority just want to live normal lives. But it's made out to be this anti-Semitism claim and
I never
finger
said
pointing.
anti-Semitism. I said, excuse me, I never said anti-Semitism. I said they can't stand Jews. And I have in my pocket, which is I'm not going to take out the charter of the Hamas. It's very easy to read and see they can't stand Jews. Now, they can't stand not only Jews, they can't stand others, and we can see how they're butchered and slaughtered all over the Middle East now. Christians are in the same boat.
Members of Jewish parliament openly state that they're going to ethnically cleanse Gaza.
That's fine. They can state whatever they want. The question is what you do.
These are elected representatives, and you are speaking on behalf of those who are democratically elected. Democratically elected, U.S. supported.
Declaration versus the Hamas.
It's very hypocritical for you to say that. It's unbelievably hypocritical.
You really don't want me to do that.
I do want to discuss this as well. I know this is very emotionally charged, so I want to kind of bring it back a little bit, but I do have to ask you. I want to talk about not necessarily Palestine, but Hamas. What does Hamas really want? Because you bring up the charter, you bring up, the covenant of Hamas, and it mentioning the obliteration of Jews. Is this fair to say?
I want to mention that this morning, while I was working out, I watched CNN.
Okay.
On CNN, the representative of the PLO, or the Palestinian Authority, okay, not the Hamas, from Egypt, was approached by the CNN anchor, and I don't remember who it was, and was asked 6 or 7 times, because we in America cannot accept no solution. So he was asked, why can't you tell the Hamas that to get off their tree and not start again tomorrow, and maybe because you guys agreed to it? And he said, no, we don't. We're one unity. And he said, but of course, Americans cannot, of course, tie the two and say Hamas is the same. So he 6 times he tried to give him an out and say, you're not like Hamas. Are you? Are you not like Hamas? He wouldn't. He said, listen, we're the same, and we both agree.
I want to give Mo a chance to respond to that. Is Hamas in Palestine, there is a unity government. Are they one and the same? I want to give you a chance to respond.
First of all, I want to say that either one doesn't completely represent the majority of the people. However, in Gaza, Hamas is the democratically elected government. In the past, they were recognized as a terrorist organization by the United States, by Canada, and by members of the European Union. But in the actual vote for an independent Palestinian state, including the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, there were 138 UN member states that voted for a state, which means they recognize them as a legitimate democratically elected government.
Hamas is not
Yes,
Hamas is not
it was a U.S. proctored election in 2006.
I do have to ask you, though, do you consider Hamas to be a terrorist network?
I feel that my actual opinion on the matter of whether I consider them a terrorist network or not isn't relevant. I feel that what they do for the people is relevant. When they were democratically elected, they built hospitals, they built schools, universities, and they brought aid into Gaza. Now, if you look at
to condemn Hamas for what they do to your people, not to mine.
I will condemn any murder. I will condemn any civilian casualties.
No, that's not the.
I am speaking across the board.
United States.
I am against any kind of violent murder targeting civilians, like the 2,000 civilians that were actually targeted with precision warfare in Gaza. I will admit all murder of innocent is wrong. Avoiding any kind of casualty is essential.
To your people, not to
Explain to me what they do to my people.
Okay, so first I'd like to address one thing that Americans have a tendency to hear and not understand. When my fellow here says the majority, there's not one Arab country that's ruled by the majority. Not one. There's a reason for that. The majority is irrelevant. For Germany, the majority was not Hitler, but it was irrelevant. They still caused huge devastation in the world. Forget the Jews. So the majority doesn't matter here. By the way, the real elected one
Israel's
is
a democracy, proclaimed democracy, and you're saying that the majority doesn't matter? So a democracy, the majority does matter in a democracy. Let's remember the definition of
Hamas
this.
was elected democratically, I remind you. Of course, there was no other election since, because that's how it happened.
And can you just stick to the point? What did they do to the people?
I do want to ask you guys, because there's a tit for tat.
They shot 20. They executed 20 last week.
Israel executed 2,490 children. Israel massacred Palestinian children.
We need to bring it back. Because there's definitely a back and forth. And obviously, this is why peace talks have fallen apart before. But I want to get away from that. Final thoughts. I'm going to give both of you guys, and please don't interrupt each other. TV, I'm going to start with you, and Mo, I'm going to let you finish it off. I want to ask you, in your mind, very concisely, is there a solution here? If so, what is it? Your turn.
In the foreseeable future, there is no solution at this point.
Okay.
There is no solution because sometimes you have such a gap in cultural debate.
It's understandable.
That you just can't bridge. And the narrative, when you see the children in the territories which are disputed, not occupied. When you see what they're fed, excuse me, children on both sides are not fed the same food and the same. They're not taught the same things, and you can see that very much.
There's definitely a cultural division.
It's easy to Google children of Gaza and then children of Israel, women of Gaza, women of Israel. Just, ladies and gentlemen, Google that. It's easy. You'll see. Go through the images. You'll see what I'm talking about. So that can't be bridged at this point. Unfortunately, maybe at some point.
We all hope at some point.
They'd like to have a state more than they'd like to kill Jews.
To clarify from you right now, you don't see in the foreseeable future, because of the cultural divisions, you don't see peace in the foreseeable future. Now, Mo, I'm going to let you wrap it up. You're the last word on this, and I want to ask you, do you see a solution? If so, what is it?
Absolutely. I think the Palestinians have compromised time and time again when it comes time for the peace talks and negotiating terms. Going all the way back to the Oslo Accords, I mean, there was a two-state solution. It was a viable state. However, every time we come to the table for the peace talks, they're compromising more. So an actual solution, if a two-state solution was something that was taken seriously, they would need to remove the siege on Gaza, allow the strangulation of the people to stop, allow them to rebuild their infrastructure, allow them to rebuild the hospitals, allow them to have a thriving economy, instead of allowing it to build up and then having these strikes against it, causing $5 billion of damage to the most densely populated area in the world, one of the most densely, 1.8 million people. So the most important thing is allowing them to survive, and it takes both sides to do this, but the siege has to be removed, and Gaza has to be able to run its own airspace, its water, and its territories for it to be a sovereign state.
So it sounds like it comes down to settlements for those on the Palestinian side. That's a major sticking point.
There can't be peace without justice first.
Okay, I want to leave it at that, and we hope that we can, hopefully peace is in the future, because this crisis is good for no one. And up next, ladies, are you daddy's little princess? Well, according to 2 professors at Marquette University, this may be a problem. This and more after the break, so stay with us. Well, obviously, on to some lighter news now. Ladies, did your dad ever call you princess when you were growing up? Did he open doors for you or make you feel at all special? Well, according to 2 Marquette University psychology professors, this may be the cause of what they call benevolent sexism. The professors surveyed female college students and their parents and asked them to evaluate their roles and attributes like weight, fitness, attractiveness, etc. Apparently, the women who held themselves in higher esteem had fathers that treated them like little princesses growing up. They call this benevolent sexism. The problem, they say, is girls who grew up with the princess treatment can't have high esteem without it, and it encourages women to fill traditional gender roles. Now, I know how I feel about this, but I want to get another young, independent woman's perspective. So joining me now to the national chair of the College Republican National Committee, Alex Smith. Alex, thanks so much for being with me today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, now, Alex, for me, this research is interesting, but again, I feel like it doesn't give us a lot of credit as women. But what's your take on it?
I absolutely agree. I think that, these are terms of endearment, and the study is just another example by liberal professors on college campuses to try to make something out of nothing.
Well, I would absolutely agree with you, and I think to be spending time to research whether calling your child princess is negatively impacting them, to me that sounds like a little bit of a waste of time and, for me, money. But moving on from that, I want to ask you about the merits of the study itself. Do you think that if your dad calls you princess, that means that you are not able to be a leader or hold yourself in high esteem when you grow up?
Absolutely not. I think that if a father uses those terms of endearment, it means that he cares very much about his daughter and wants to see her do well and wants to see her have a positive image of herself. I know that certainly my dad used terms of endearment like that towards me, and certainly he always encouraged me to succeed academically, professionally, and in anything that I set my mind to.
Well, yeah, and just because you call someone princess doesn't mean that you're coddling them. And also, I kind of find it insulting to say that as women, if we're called something when we're little, that somehow that impacts us and we're not able to be leaders. To me, that doesn't give me a lot of credit, because I would say, hey, if you call me a princess, call me whatever you want to call me. I'm still going to pursue those leadership roles because, hey, I have a brain. What about you?
I agree. I mean, I think it's just about the values that are enforced at home by parents that really matter in terms of a child's upbringing and how well that child, male or female, will do later on in life, professionally or academically at school. I think that it matters very much, to have parents who are supportive. And if those names are used, simply as a term of affection to kind of go along with that support, I don't really see the harm in it.
And I also don't see it as sexist at all. But I want to move on to another topic and another word that is attempting to be banned. So we've got a campaign right now to ban the word bossy when referring to little girls, saying that it hinders their leadership abilities, again, on down the road. And this has been spearheaded by one of the top officials at Facebook, saying that she doesn't want to hear little girls being called bossy anymore. So what's your take on bossy?
I heard about this earlier this summer when this whole thing came out. Mm-hmm. And I remember, as a child, I was trying to think back to, was I called bossy? Was I not? And, it doesn't matter. Exactly. I grew into the person that I was going to become based on the leadership abilities that I had. and also by the support of my parents and my colleagues and by my educators. I think that, you know, simply by banning a word calls attention to it in a way that suggests that women need saving from this word, that we can't say this word around women because it weakens them. And I reject that wholesale. I mean, you can't hide little girls or little boys from real life. You can't hide them from the unfairness of life. And sometimes you're unfairly stereotyped or unfairly judged because of attributes that are out of your control. But I think that it's learning how to succeed, you know, beyond that criticism is what makes you a better leader.
And honestly, I get it all the time. I mean, if someone might call me bossy, I have been a leader growing up, as I'm sure, obviously, by your position now, you're a leader as well. And I think that something's to be said by the fact that Facebook's chief operating officer, Sheryl Sandberg, is one that spearheaded this Ban Bossy campaign. And she's the head of a company. And she said she was called bossy. So now she's in a position of prominence. So to me, this seems like a contradiction. What do you think?
Well, I think it absolutely shows that when you're labeled as something when you're young, or when you're teased, or when you're made fun of, or in some way made to feel different when you're younger, it only makes you that much more, it makes you want to succeed that much more, to prove yourself that much more. I mean, life is full of adversity, and simply by starting, you know, a cushy public relations campaign to ban a word is not going to shield young kids from the realities of life.
And I absolutely agree with you, and we need to be developing a tough skin, especially in this environment right now. Thanks so much for being with us, Alex. And coming up next, we all know government surveillance threatens privacy, but it also threatens the freedom of the press. Find out how when On Point returns. Stay with us.
Protecting a source is paramount for me. If I can't report a story without keeping a source safe, I'm not going to report the story.
But what's clear now is that it doesn't necessarily require a reporter to reveal the sources.
The United States government is collecting huge amounts of information, electronic records of emails, phone calls, actual chat conversations, photographs. Journalists are afraid that there's a record of their communications, of their interaction, and that that's going to feed into a leak investigation or a leak prosecution.
We sometimes feel, or I feel at least, like you're operating like somebody in the mafia. You've got to go around with a bag full of quarters, and if you can find a payphone, use it, or use like drug dealers use, you know, throwaway burner phones. These are all the steps that we have to take to get rid of an electronic trail. To have to take those kind of steps, you know, makes journalists feel like we're criminals and like we're doing something wrong. And I don't think we are. I think we're providing a useful service to Americans to know what's going on in their government and what's happening.
Well, we have to be extra careful what we say and send these days because Big Brother, aka the U.S. government, is watching us and closely. As a journalist, this trend troubles me, and I'm not alone. The Human Rights Watch and the American Civil Liberties Union are both calling out large-scale surveillance programs for hindering journalists. Sources feel vulnerable, and journalists are now going to great lengths to protect them by encrypting emails, text, and phone calls, and some are even cutting out electronic communication altogether. And as you can imagine, this is making them feel more like spies than journalists. Joining me now to give his take on this issue is Huffington Post blogger and attorney Mark Baer. Thanks so much for being with us, Mark.
Oh, thank you.
Now, I have to ask you, I have the luxury of being an on-air personality, so I get to have my sources sitting right in front of me. But for traditional journalists, this is causing a real problem. What's your take on it?
Well, it's causing definitely a problem, and the materials all play that out. It's not the first time that this has happened.
Absolutely.
If you
Going
look
back
at
to Watergate.
If you look at Watergate, you'll see that at least one of the interviews was done in a sub-ground parking lot at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good history lesson there.
Yeah.
But I have to ask you, now we have to worry about our communication. So obviously it was a concern back in the Nixon administration, but I'm glad you brought that up because Nixon lost his job over this. But it seems like the Obama administration's getting away with it. So why is this?
Well, I think we need to make a bit of a distinction.
Okay.
In Nixon administration with Watergate, the spying was done for purposes of figuring out, for him to maintain power and see what his enemies in the other party were doing. Currently, We're talking about a problem with terrorism. Terrorism that's
Okay, but I
occurring.
have to ask you, journalists, though, communicating with sources, how come they have a right to say, oh, you're dealing with terrorism, it's national security? This is hindering real journalists, as you saw, from doing their jobs day to day, covering the government, covering law enforcement. So I don't think it's fair to say it's just for national security, but please explain why you think that.
Well, I mean, I'm not suggesting that, look, I read the whole report.
Right.
I'm not suggesting that there can't be things and shouldn't be things that are altered. It's problematic for journalism and it's problematic for attorneys. I'm both. And with, as far as being a lawyer, the attorney-client confidentiality is major, and also privileged communications that are now being accessed and listened to by the government. So I am not going to sit here and say that I agree with what's going on. What I am going to say is that we need to decide. I would like to know what terrorist activities were stopped as a result of the kind of work that they're doing.
And you know what? I would as well, but we haven't seen any examples. And to me, that's a big problem. But I want to move it back to journalists now, because like you said, you are a journalist and an attorney. So this should be hitting you especially hard. Have you noticed anything like that? Sources not necessarily wanting to talk to you, or people being a little bit more apprehensive now because of this large-scale surveillance?
Well, from a personal perspective, the kind of writing that I tend to do is based on other research and things like that that's accessible, as opposed to contacting different sources. So I haven't personally experienced that issue.
But what about the chilling effect? Because people that are covering these large-scale operations, people that are covering, like I said, law enforcement, trying to put a check on the government, they do have reason to be scared. As we saw at the beginning, after the break, we saw that real journalists right now are saying that this is a major problem. So don't you see that chilling effect there?
It is a major problem, but and I do think that everybody would admit that the government needs to step forward, the administration needs to step forward and demonstrate how something so broad is important for national security. And if they can't, then they need to implement some or all of the proposed changes in this report.
So as well. I think that the public definitely does have a right to know. And like you said, I'm waiting for those examples as well. But thank you so much for being with me, and I really appreciate your unique insight into this. And moving on now to some final thoughts for the day. Let's talk about freedom. What is America's favorite freedom? Well, free speech, of course. The First Amendment's protection of free speech is of paramount importance to our democracy and our personal liberty. Freedom of speech allows us to speak our minds openly and honestly without fear of government restraint. Freedom of speech allows we the people to uncover the truth. It emerges from the marketplace of ideas. Sure, some speech might offend people. Some people may even want certain words like bossy to be symbolically banned. But what does this do for democracy? Nothing. Murdering words and ideas that we don't like hurts democracy and threatens the American way of life. And we Americans love this freedom. In fact, according to the State of the First Amendment survey, a whopping 47% of those polled named freedom of speech as the most important right. Free speech is not a luxury for democracy. It is an absolute necessity. It should be and must be protected to the fullest extent by our laws, leaders, and citizens. This freedom is close to my heart. For me, this freedom is essential to what I do and to what this network stands for. And you better believe I will do whatever I can to protect this. And with that, thank you so much for getting on point with me. And until next time, take care.